Good afternoon and welcome to our 107th episode on how to build business cases for sustainable success in partnership with Equans. My name is Sophie Hooper and I'm the IWFM's Head of Policy and Research. While today's episode is focusing on our new guidance note and how to make good sustainable business cases, it is part of our wider sustainability program that seeks to empower our members to achieve net zero, an ambition which has become even more important today, and given the last few weeks of Spanish headlines and our reality of wetter winters and summers, which are causing great havoc as our communities and buildings struggle to deal with it. Our program is driven largely by our sustainability surveys, which outline where the gaps and opportunities are for activity, not just for our members' activity and agency, but also for IWFM activity, which filters through in our guidance, such as this one, our professional standards, our policy work, and of course, the courses that we run to support our members. You will all know, of course, that making sustainability improvements to buildings has many benefits for its users, the organizations in the building, or those owning it, and the building itself. Our Market Outlook survey 2023, however, showed us that that's our sustainability survey 2023 showed us, not for the first time, that lack of funding is a common weakness in many sustainability plans. Moreover, the report said that the entire investment process needs to be rethought, as the research showed that return on investment expectations are pretty much detached from reality, with as many as 43% of our respondents being expected to meet or exceed normal ROI criteria. The lack of robust business cases and inappropriate ROIs were clearly identified as major barriers to implementing sustainability measures, affecting decisions to achieve net zero. We know, however, from that same survey that FMs don't want to ditch the return on investment process, they want to improve it, and 52% recognize the need to improve how they capture the data to make the case for future investment. And that's something that's obviously also quite apparent in the guidance. Our 2023 report detailed several routes to get the funds flowing, but it's clear, of course, that underpinning all those routes is that need for guidance on how to improve the business case itself and what benefits and criteria to leverage and what language to use to unlock those much needed funding. Fast forward 9 months, and here we are today with the launch of our new guidance note in partnership with Equans. And we are working together with Equans because together we have a shared ambition really to make sure that we can achieve net zero and that we can empower our communities to actually get there. We obviously very much hope that the new guidance note will help workplace and FM professionals to develop and present structured business cases. The guidance, well, actually, Sunil will talk a little bit more about what the guidance contains. He's the author of the guidance. He will provide that short presentation, and then we'll dive into the discussion with Matt. But as normal, I would like to encourage you, the audience, to ask questions throughout. We will pick these up and then bring them into the conversation at the most opportune point of the discussion. If we don't draw them into the conversation, we'll tackle them at the end of the discussion. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat, because we don't pick them up there. And like all platforms, you will be able to ask your questions anonymously if you would prefer to do so. So before we get into the presentation, Matt, may I please ask you to introduce yourself and why you are here today, please?
Okay, yes. So my name is Matt Smith. I'm currently the Energy and Sustainability Manager working for Equans. I've got over 13 years experience of working in sustainability and energy management, and the last 6 of those years have been dedicated to energy management. I've got experience of working in public sector organisations as an embedded energy manager in the healthcare sector and higher education. during those roles, I've had lots of experience of developing business cases for a wide range of energy efficiency projects, ranging from very large PV projects, so solar PV, to air source heat pumps, thermal improvements of buildings, LED lighting. So I've been lucky enough to get a real wide array of experience with developing business cases and then putting those projects into practice. So I'm here today representing Equans, and it's an honour to be working with the IWFM to develop this procedure, and I look forward to answering any questions from the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Sunil?
Yeah, fantastic. And thank you, Sophie, IWFM, for inviting me again to both author the guidance notes and to also present as well. So a little bit of background on myself. So I've spent 25 years working in the profession and looking at sustainability within buildings, so working through the FM side, planning side, and also design construction side along that business life cycle. So within here, there's a range of roles that I've had, but an awful lot of that is about how do we understand the deliverability of buildings, how do we understand how they're going to be used, and feed that into any of the changes that do take place. Data as part of that, and accurate data, becomes a critical element, but so is the means and the mechanisms for how we would go about to manage and collect that data. So a large part of what I'll talk about will be around that data element and how we communicate that kind of information. Next slide, please. So in terms of the work that we're doing, and Sophie's mentioned about the ROI question, which we posed as part of the sustainability survey. So that raised an area and a question which has probably been in place for a very long time, probably over a decade now, around the quality of business cases. ROI and business cases are very much the outcomes, the endpoints of what we see. So we put forward a suggestion, an idea, and the business either doesn't pick it up or bats it into the following year. The initial questions, though, is have we pitched that at the right area, and are we looking at that fully? And a lot of those questions also came out from the energy management guidance notes that was published earlier this year. And that note looked at how do we reduce the energy consumption, so the capital activities, the waste activities, and the approach that we go through to being able to reduce the energy. And a key and critical part of that was around the data side of things. So the energy management guidance and this business case go hand in hand together, and I'd recommend looking at both of those two documents together. Next slide, please. So when we looked at the business case and the requirements here, and Sophie's gone through some of this information already in terms of the survey overall, but some of the items identified from the 2022 outputs is starting to show that the majority of workplace and facilities managers are looking at ROI requirements for projects, are looking at relatively short-term requirements, timelines to be able to deliver, but also that their ability to be able to do that was somewhat hampered. So the take up of good ideas and good suggestions weren't necessarily being followed through. And so parts of that then tends to build more towards the reasons why that's taken place. So the purpose of this document is very much intended for the facilities management community, and it's about what needs to go into making a successful business case. So how do we put forward those items? There is a heavy focus in here on the energy aspects and the carbon reduction aspects that are in here, but that structured business case would follow through for the social elements as well, and the other wider environmental elements where we talk about having that data quality and then how do we use and communicate that data. So the intention here is it's about bringing forwards those insights. So it is about not just that data part, but it's also about the communication of that information. So how do we communicate effectively towards those senior leaders within an organisation to get their support and buy-in? So the document itself is very much about incorporating, whether it's a landlord-tenant, whether it's an in-house provision, an outsourced major provision. There's a methodology and a process which is being followed here. Next slide, please. So the business drivers that we have do extend beyond talking about energy and energy cost reductions. And this is quite critical when we want to put forward some of these suggestions for sign-off and approval. A lot of this does come back to what is the purpose for the organisation? What is it that they're intending and trying to do? And how are you able to support them on that as well? So it isn't just about being able to save a bit of money or to being able to reduce the carbon. That's really important. But the add-on elements, the add-on benefits, which you can highlight and also mention, will help to be able to provide a more rounded view of what the initiative will be. So if you're going through an exercise and you're upgrading the plant room, whether it's the chiller units, the boiler units, the heating systems, etc., if you go through an exercise where you're able to reduce the amount of equipment that's in there, even put it into an external space, you're freeing up space which can be used for rental purposes and rental activities. And this comes from a conversation that I've had with an organisation where we spoke about energy efficiency measures and reduction and the new equipment going in, and it was batted straight back to say, we're not interested, we don't have the budget to do that. We instead then spoke about having a project where they could increase the rental space by a further 5 to 10%. They could also start to look at improving the quality of space. That got signed off straight away. It was exactly the same project that we were putting forwards, but spoke about in a very different way. One from an FM perspective of cost savings, efficiencies of the equipment and so on, and one very much speaking for what the owner of the building was looking for and what they were going to sign off on. So that language of how that gets communicated is quite important. The second area as well is about the operational controls within the building. So this is very much about occupancy levels and about, effectively, it's the happiness of staff, productivity of those individuals. And for an awful lot of organisations, the way that individuals perform, how happy they are, how comfortable they are, has a huge impact upon their productivity. So by being able to talk about reductions in sickness levels, by being able to start to communicate about improvements in that productivity, again, does help hugely. Again, we did a project example where we spoke about changes that took place within a catering operations and a project there. We supported that by also talking about the improved productivity that would come through from those catering option changes. And that really did help to change the ROI of the project by bringing in the people elements that also went forward in the project. And then it's also about the sustainability criteria that's coming through. So it's the data, it's the metrics, it's the ability of the technologies that are able to go in. So it's moving away from that like-for-like change and instead starting to look at different forms of technologies and changing what needs to happen. So if it's mentioned about what's happened, the awful events in Spain that have taken place over the last week, we have had a lot of that as well ourselves. Huge storm events that have taken place across much of the UK as well over the past few months. So managing ahead for those kinds of activities means that we do have different options that we can put forward, but that brings risk, and it's about how do we manage that risk and that communication. So again, talking about those better metrics does help with the ROI. Yeah. So the key issues that we've mentioned is very much about that data side, but it's about how do we utilize that information. So there's mechanisms in here where we're then starting to clean and analyze the data. So first of all, do we have the correct data and is it in the right places? If we have secondary level data, do we trust that data and does it all add up together? Once we've cleaned and analysed the information itself, what does it look like and how do we start to understand the information that's coming through? So the key part here then is that third step. It's about being able to interpret the data. What is it that information telling us? What's the insights that's able to come through that's going to help us to make the decisions? And those decisions is going to be not just on a carbon reduction and an energy reduction, but it's also on how are we going to help the organisation achieve its main goals and ambitions. So depending on the type of business that's happening and now the role that we're playing in that is the kinds of outcomes that we're looking at. So that making the decisions then becomes quite a critical item within here. So understanding who the stakeholders are to sign that off and what their needs are then feeds into those initial stages of the data and also what it is that we're trying to communicate. As the final part of it is then taking action. And the take action is also being able to prove that you've been able to do what you've said you're going to do. So as with most of these projects, you're given a chance in terms of having the funding being provided to you. If that fails, then the conversation is more about how was that understood and communicated and how do you respond to that as opposed to it just not meeting up with the original expectations. So there is a conversation as well about ongoing risks and challenges that comes through. So the ROI that we have is very much about how do we improve that return on investment. And it is a sequential, the more that we can start to do with the data and the information that we have to turn that into the insights and to be able to demonstrate and prove, the more that ROI increases. So again, a lot of what we're trying to do is about how do we provide and how do we inform and how do we support the FM community to provide that knowledge, the insights and the action. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned a lot here about a critical item of linkage within that business strategy. So here are 6 questions really to look at the at project stage. And it's about each of the individual projects starting to look and saying, do we understand the answers associated with this? Have we communicated that information into the business? And a lot of that revolves around, do we know who's going to be signing off on the projects that are going to be taking place? Do we understand what those changing roles, those goals, those targets are going to be? But also, have we understood the risks and have we communicated that information effectively? And have we understood how the information also needs to be presented as well? So there's an element where we start talking about the different ways of communicating into the finance information. So rather than talking about simple paybacks, it's more involved in talking about elements that include depreciation and looking at forward measures. But that is financial language, conversations and communication. And that becomes quite critical to get also the sign off and the buy-in. That is the same conversation that you have with the other non-financial benefits. So the behavioural, the productivity aspects are also brought in as part of that as well. And then finally, it's also about what's going to happen at the end of the project as well. So once it's installed, how do we know that it's been a success? The project's happened, it's in place. It's about being able to continue. So we don't stop at the point where we've handed it over. We continue it on for 12, 24 months. That forms the demonstration that the project has been successful, but it also gives you kudos that you've done a good job, you know what you're talking about, and you're more likely to get funding into the future as well. So that's a quick overview into the guidance notes. It's released earlier this week, and details of it are on or in this webinar pack as well. I'll hand back over to Sophie.
Thank you very much, Sunil, and may I invite Matt as well to come back? There you are. And we'll go straight into the discussion. Now, obviously, your last slide, Sunil, talked a lot about alignment with the business strategy and finding hooks to make sure that the business case lands well. But your key issues slide did talk about occasionally not getting it approved. So I guess my first question is still, what are the key barriers to not getting business cases approved?
Yeah.
And I'll come to you, Matt, later for your expertise in this.
So I think from my experience, there's a range of different challenges that we have. There are constraints and financial constraints. We've had period come out of COVID, and financial budgets have been more constrained with changes in the financial systems, but that's across the board in general. So as an organisation as a whole, that's understood that budgets might be under strain and stress. But we also have other times where there's a lack of understanding at the decision-making side about why the project is needed and what benefit it's going to have. And that's down to competency, capacity of understanding at the senior levels. And there is a role that we've got from an FM side to be able to provide that communication. That's an enabler for forward decision-making to take place. So that education is quite a key one. The other key gap that we have is around the data and the way that we communicate the information. Communicating as a simple payback, communicating as just a carbon or an energy figure really does downplay the work that we do. So we are looking at it on a building as a whole and as a facility as a whole. So we should be putting forward those projects and those recommendations where it is changing the way that people work as well as part of that.
Okay. Matt, you work in a hospital, so that has got its own particular setting. It's a PFI contract. So your experience of the barriers, how do they translate to your context?
Yeah, so it's very similar barriers of limited capital funding and concerns about the rate of returns, requiring very competitive rate of returns to justify a project. There's always lots of other things which need funding and critical requirements, so we're competing against those. And I think really the critical element to overcome that success is trying to reframe the financial model. An example would be with a solar PV system, which tend to have quite low rates of return. They're quite a long-term project, and it's important to try and reframe the finance, presenting a MPV model, so demonstrating the cost return of the project over its life cycle, which then can provide a very attractive financial situation. It's also about demonstrating that a project which can save energy or generate cheaper renewable energy over a long term offers financial benefits such as a more stable price once the system installed and you paid for it. You know how much that's for its life cycle. So that but also it's about demonstrating the non-financial benefits of energy and sustainability projects to really build the context of the business case of a project.
Thank you for that. And you know, we've already talked about some of the key issues around broadening the benefits from cost and energy perspective, and you touched on some of them. But I wonder if, before we go to data, etc., if we could talk a little bit more about particular experience of benefits presentations that particularly resonated with senior leaders. And the reason, I guess, why I ask about that is because we can all see what happened in Spain. There is a genuine need to adapt and mitigate for this. I mean, we've moved beyond mitigating. We really need to adapt. But yes, how do we make sure that that C-suite really sees that investment as ripe, but also, you know, using those broader benefits can you use an example? And Sunil, I'll start with you.
Yeah. So I think, when we start to look at forward funding practices and looking at a climate risk and opportunity aspect that's in here, but there's a starting point. So McKinsey did a piece of research this last year now. They're looking at up to 40% of the value of a property being lost if no action on climate risk is taken. So this is becoming a huge issue for those that have involvement in property. So the owners of property, those that have got long-term investment in the property, because what we're looking at is a significant devaluation of that property, not in the long term, in the near term. And if we're looking at most asset changes being anything from 7 years up to 25 years, for some of those decisions to be, the assets themselves to last for, that's now moving us towards the 2050 cycle as well. So I don't think a lot of that has been really understood by decision makers. You're within one cycle or two cycles, or one cycle of the 2050 targets that organisations might be making in terms of becoming net zero as well. And it's about, again, raising some of those questions and those comments in there as well. So working with an organisation at the minute, they have a building refurbishment exercise which they're looking at doing. They have a space in an area which is a more working operations from a research perspective. And we're starting to ask questions of, where do we house those individuals? They're currently on a southwest face of a building, which has a greater amount of sunlight that goes into it, and therefore a greater amount of heat gain. And so it needs much more cooling within that space to take, and for those individuals to operate effectively. Moving that to the north side of the building significantly reduces and makes the individuals much more comfortable and much more productive as well. But it does increase the cost of the project overall, because you're having to shift the equipment over there as well. So that's an active conversation which is happening, which is about, how do we move into the future? It's changing the location of where certain activities are occurring, because we know temperatures are going to be increasing. We're going to have a huge more heat gain that's coming through. So either that, or there's going to have to be a huge amount of additional cooling that's going to take place, and probably a lot more people complaining because it's too hot within that space as well.
Thank you. Matt, I'd like to come to you and your experience, because we've previously talked about how difficult it can sometimes be to really, well, shift that focus away from the financial benefits and talk about those wider perspectives. But when we met beforehand, you talked about linking up to broader business goals. Can you talk a little bit more about your experience across that area, please?
Yeah, sure. And I think going back to trying to deliver a successful business case to senior managers, my experience has really been to trying to link the benefits of the project to the strategy. And firstly, that is looking at the strategy of carbon reduction. So being able to demonstrate that a project will save energy and carbon linked to those net zero goals, but also trying to look at other elements within an organisation's strategy and how the projects will feed into those overall objectives. An example I can sort of comes to mind is when I was working in a university setting. I was building a business case for a large smart LED light replacement project. So it was very easy to try and provide the energy cost and carbon savings, but to develop a really well-rounded business model. I also looked at the benefits of improving the light standard in the room. So that's really linking to one of the core strategic objectives of the University of Student Experience, getting the right light levels in teaching areas. But also the project offered a key benefit in terms of occupancy data through the smart lighting. And that was linking to one of the other objectives or challenges the university was facing, is trying to understand how their spaces are being used. And I think it was looking at the additional benefits of the project and articulating that into a business case and presentation really helped get that project approved and over the line. So I think that's just a concrete example of how to build additional benefits and link it back to the strategic goals and issues that an organisation's facing.
Thank you. I would like to, well, first of all, thank you for starting to submit the questions. We will start picking them up and answering as well in our discussion. But for now, I'd like to pick up on something that you've said as well around reporting and accounting, and both Sunil and Matt, you kind of touched about that, the importance of the broader benefits for businesses overall. And I'd like to pick up on the role of service providers in first instance, and I think you can both add some value perspective on that in taking in more accurate accounting role for wider benefits when it comes to investment project, because it is much broader than just the core project. Who would like to comment on that further, about the role of service providers in that? Matt?
I suppose in terms of the service of providers, it's really about providing additional value for the client in terms of what their requirements are and how we can really meet those core needs, not just in the core contract, but also considering about what as an overall large organisation we can provide for our clients in terms of the, for example, we can offer PV solutions which are funded from a PPA agreement, which becomes more affordable for a client. So it's really looking at those additional needs and trying to match what as an organisation we can offer to the specific requirements of a client, and then presenting those in a attractive and understandable method, really.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sunil?
Yeah, and I think the role of the service provider is a body who's and an organisation who's been there and done it before. And there's a large number of providers in the UK. They all have specialisms of what they're able to put forward, and the breadth and the depth and scale of what they're able to provide and to communicate on that as well. But the starting point is, in many cases, it's about the service provider asking questions back to the client to challenge, to clarify what the needs are for the business as well. So in many cases, the initial request or the requirement that might come through is something which the client may not have even understood or recognised, first of all, or they don't know what they don't know. So being able to clarify, the service providers in a much better position, having the experience of running it through beforehand, learning about what works and what doesn't work, and being able to put forward those questions, manage some of those risks, but also starting to open up the avenue of what the other benefits are going to be. So, Matt, where you started talking about the lighting benefits that came through at the university, that would be a great example where you're able to tweak the type of lighting that you'd have to be able to provide a better response for the project overall. Might be an uplift in the fee, but actually the value that comes out from that is now far, far greater than would have been previously. Then the other key role for the service provider is being a single point of contact for its delivery. So either whether it's delivered in-house or whether it's via a third party, you have a trusted group of people on site who can manage it day to day. So that risk management elements of it and the deliverability elements of it is also included and managed as part of that.
Thank you, Sunil. I want to talk about some funding routes, because the Sustainability Report 2023 touched on, creating a bit more of the flow of investment, and that there are things like special budgets, relax or scrap return criteria, considering alternative funding models. Matt, I want to start with you because you already mentioned one of those models, PPA funding. I mean, I'd be leading the question. I'd be leading the witness by going, what have you seen works well? Because you already mentioned PPA, but can you talk a little bit more about that? Because ultimately the role of service providers is providing that broader support of what works for clients.
So yeah, the power purchase agreement, the PPA, has been a model which I've seen has worked really effectively for especially public sector organisations which might not have that capital available to invest on top of normal requirements. So in effect, the model is able to install a renewable or issue energy efficiency projects at no cost to the organisation. And then for every unit saved or every unit generated from renewable energy, the client would pay for that at a set rate. Ideally, that rate will be lower than what they are paying for from their utility provider. So it has a double benefit, really, that the client is saving from financially, it's paying a lower rate, and also it's benefiting from its energy net zero targets. In addition to that, there's the benefit that these contracts tend to be very long, often 25 years. So there's that financial stability built into the model. So it's not necessary to, it's not necessary, you know, consistently what you're going to be paying for your unit of electricity over a long period. So I think that seems to be a really effective model for looking at an alternative rate of funding projects. Have we lost to now?
Yes, I was just trying to investigate live on the call.
Okay.
Sunil will have one.
But there's other models as well. There's a lease. Sorry. Go ahead.
Keep on talking, Matt.
So also there's other financial models, a leasing model. We've also had success working with a utility company and then having a PPA model where the client, the company will generate electricity offsite and then sell it back to the client for a fixed time frame at a fixed rate from a purely renewable sources. So there's lots of routes to consider of how to finance and fund and support the client's needs for achieving those goals.
Brilliant. Now, I wanted to bring in the question from one of our attendees, but I will wait till Sunil gets back for that one. I think in the meantime, it might be useful for us to move on to the data conversation, because it seems that I joined the Institute 7 years ago, and we have continued to have this conversation for the last 7 years about we need good data, we need platforms, we need well, better data. So really, not having the right data is not only a significant barrier to achieving net zero, but just to even get to the business case. Having good quality data would also help FMs to lock themselves in as the go-to information about the asset's sustainability and impacts on that assets now. But I was just wondering if you could talk through an experience where you worked through an issue with data, whether that was irrelevant data, lack of data, incorrect data, inaccurate data, and how you manage that entire process then to get that back on track.
Sure. Do you want me to start with that one?
Yes, please.
So yeah, you're correct. I think really the foundation of building a really good business case and understanding what opportunities you have for a building or a site is having really good energy data. And I think that the go-to solution is to have a automatic metering system, so an independent system which can pull off your automatic meter readings every 15 minutes and record and provide good analysis. That obviously, the more you can itemize that information, so have not just for a building or a site, but start to break it down for floors or services, then the more data, the better. You can build a picture and understanding of the building or site you're managing. Mm-hmm. So I think if and then it's about verifying that data, so taking consistent manual meter readings, so you're checking that data is consistently accurate and is matching up what you're seeing from the AMR system is really important. Where I've had experiences of poor data or gaps in the data, the solution is firstly having that process in place where you've got the manual data, so you can go back and check and try and fill in the gaps and build an estimation model. Or alternatively, it's the option is that you can start to model a building's energy consumption based on its thermal loss and break it down for estimations for a site. I think it's not. I think that those are the sort of challenges about data, really.
Okay. I do wonder, though, what particular quality control systems you've got in place to make sure that the data is correct and accurate.
So I think the quality control are those manual meter readings. So you make sure that you go and take a manual meter reading at least once a year, and then check that against what the automatic meter reading system is providing you. Then you know that there's a good level of accuracy between the two. Also, having some level of calibration of your meters as well to check that you're getting accuracy from your meter.
Brilliant. Sunil, to loop you back in, we had started to talk about the issue around data, which we have been talking about. It seems like forever, but it's important not just for the business case. It's obviously important to really establish the FM as the fountain of all knowledge when it comes to data. Matt just gave his experience. Obviously, the guidance touches on some of the data issues. Is there anything else that you would like to add at this particular point?
Yeah, so there's a number of different ways of how we can obtain data. So from an organizational perspective, we've seen lots of strange conversations that are taking place. We're doing an ESOS assessment for an organization who had communicated, multi-tenanted building, that communicated to the tenants that there was no metering available and all data was apportioned for the building as a whole. When we were doing the walkthrough of the floor and then also into the basement area, we spotted 6 meters which were specifically for the floor that the tenant had, and the landlord said we didn't want to provide the meter data because it was too much time for ourselves to do that. So we do also have options where data may be available, but it's not in the interest of a landlord necessarily sometimes to provide that. So actually going in and looking in plant rooms and asking questions sometimes yields a lot of data and information as well. And then outside of that, where you're getting involved potentially in more capital related projects, there are other options of how we capture the data. So there's some CIBSE standards, which is referenced in the back of the guidance, and CIBSE TM22, which is Technical Memorandum 22 and 46, are 2 different ways of how you go about collecting data based upon the assets which are being used. So it's a bottom-up approach, and you collect run hours and you collect the type of equipment and nameplate ratings. So if you had no meter in any way, shape or form, you can start to build up a good idea of the amount of energy that you're using for those individual activities as well. They are more project related than necessarily talking about the whole building, but it does give you good quality information that you can start to use. So just because you don't have half-hour meter data, or you don't have direct metered space activity, doesn't mean that you can't generate and capture good quality data that can be used.
Thank you for that addition. Just before you dropped off, we were talking about funding. You might have caught some bits of it. I have a very useful question as well from an attendee around the government and its incentivization towards organizations to invest in sustainability. How can the government do that, given that we've just recently had the budget and some of the announcements were, well, not too encouraging. But what can the government do to incentivize organizations to invest in sustainability so they engage more than just do the minimum requirements?
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that are happening in the background around energy efficiency and energy management. There was the report that was produced earlier this week, which has given confirmation that the UK can achieve net zero electricity by 2030. But it does talk about some of the risks associated and some of the challenges that needs to be made both by organisations and also the government to achieve that. That in itself is a major stumbling block which has been resolved. The direct funding elements, so simple things like that government can do is act in the way that they want the rest of the business to act. So we have things like energy performance certificates and display energy certificates that are in place. The government could turn around and say, we're only going to work in buildings which are A-rated. And so we require all of our buildings to be at a certain level. So when we go out to the market to look at new properties, we're only going to be looking at A-rated buildings. It's a model that has worked very well in places like Australia and in Netherlands as well, where they've deployed very similar approaches. And that's kick-started the whole commercial sector as well, which is then rolled on because you have a direct benefit of having a better performing building. There are the regulations around energy performance certificates, so the private rented sector regulations, which is currently talking around a B or a C rated by 2030. And again, those can be improved and developed upon further as well for those kinds of regulations. We have already got in place the ESOS regulations in the phase 4, which is talking about annual reporting of energy efficiency measures which are taking place and the publication of that into the public domain. So we can start to see what organisations are doing versus what they're saying, but that gives us an ability to have a ratchet through as well. So come 2027, we have to be publishing a net zero plan for scope 1 and 2 emissions for all of those properties and a means of how we get there. And then we will have the regulations next year, which is coming through, which again starts to talk about transition plans for larger organisations. And again, how are they going to meet net zero, but given a bit more meat on the bones about how specifically they're going to do that. So there's a lot of regulations which are existing, a lot of activities which the government is doing. From an FM side, it's about how do we connect all of those different points together to say, with one set of activities, we can answer the questions for both the corporate reporting side, the ESOS reporting side, and the rental property side in terms of changing which tenanted properties that we have.
Not all of our members work for large organisations, though. So how do you think that's filtering through to smaller organisations?
So the smaller companies as well, so that tenant landlord element then becomes quite key. So changing the regulations there to have and putting the onus upon either landlord taking on a role or a better dialogue needs to be in place. So we want to avoid situations of a landlord saying, we do have meters, but I don't want to spend the time having to give you that information. That's what we want to avoid. in those sorts of scenarios. So how do we enable data that is available to be transferred? How do we put the onus on change needing to happen within the buildings rather than on avoidance of it or looking for reasons not for those projects not to take place?
Okay, thank you. I would like to move to a particular point that was raised earlier in the presentation around don't stop when the project has started and has been handed over. I've spoken with you both beforehand, and it's been raised many a times within our sustainability SIG as well, that it's quite important to build trust amongst relationships, especially where service providers also come in to support in-house teams, that expected benefits are being realized when projects are delivered. So not stopping the ROI activity, frankly, when the business case has been done. But can you both bring this to life a little bit more about how you've managed and used standards really to show how the expected benefits are actually realized when projects are delivered?
Yeah.
Matt, do you want to go first?
Yep, sure. So the standard which I typically use is the IP MVP model, which is a sort of a standard approach for demonstrating and verifying that energy savings have been achieved after a project is put in place. And the groundwork of that is to normalize the energy data based on a driver, which is typically outside temperature, to normalize your data and compare it against what it would have been in the normal situations to what it is after the project. And then using that model, you can have a bit much more certainty that you've achieved the energy savings you expect to see after the normalization process. So one area where we've done that is de-steamed the building a few years ago, taking steam boilers out and put conventional boilers in, and was able to demonstrate huge energy savings following that process, and it was verified by that model. Another approach I've used is the ISO 50001. So using that that EMS standard to demonstrate that a building, firstly identify where the big opportunities are across a site, implementing energy savings or efficiency savings on that element of the site, and then through continual improvement and review, demonstrate that energy has been saved in that area, and using the continual improvement approach to really check, act, do, and then can illustrate that savings have been achieved.
Brilliant. Sunil, your experience across this piece?
Yes, I think for larger organisations, we're tending to use, so the larger organisations would have multiple projects that are taking place, either because they've got lots of buildings or they've got very large buildings. We tend to look at KPIs which are developed for the organisation and will run on for all of the projects that are taking place. So we have sustainability overlays and overlaps that goes through from design, and it's about making sure that the KPIs means something for the organisation.
Yeah, you're still here.
Okay, so it's to make sure that the KPIs mean something for the organisation and has relevance to them, but also that they then follow through and the data is captured and collected to support that as well. All of organisations, it's looking at something like soft landings as a good example. So the soft landings approach is about having a golden thread that goes through, which seems to be in vogue for governments. So to go through from initial stage and into the operations as well. And again, it's looking at how do we understand about the performance of that? But that individual becomes invested in making sure that it does work. And again, it's a perfect role for the FM team to follow through with being involved from the design stage through into operations and making sure that all the stakeholders are happy with the end result that's come out of it as well.
Thank you. I kind of want to move also to one of the last sections of the guidance and to something that's an extremely important part of FM roles, and that's risk management. I just wanted to understand a little bit more, or for you to talk through an experience when something went wrong on a project, but the communications that you make all of the difference around the perception of the issue. And Sunil, I think I'm first going to stay with you before then I will move to Matt around where the typical areas of risks are coming to.
Yeah. So I think the risks will be different for organisations because a lot of it depends upon the profile and the appetite of risk that comes out. So some are happier with having a wider risk margin than others. That in itself is a question to ask and to understand is what's the risk profile of the business. But the typical risks will be around poor quality data that might be in place, and where and how would that manifest itself in terms of potential returns that might be coming through. So are there critical areas in it, or have you managed the data so that irrelevance of the solution, you're able to talk with confidence about the return that's going to happen. There's another risk, which is around the ability to implement and install the equipment. We did a piece of work with one of the fire brigades and installed a series of equipments on site. The FM team at the time communicated that they were comfortable and confident about installing the equipment, but ultimately it's the first time that many of them had done so, and the equipment didn't work correctly when it was first installed. Bringing the contractor or the manufacturer back around then enabled those systems to work correctly, and the client ended up rolling out for another 20 or 30 units afterwards. So actually being able to install correctly doesn't mean that you don't need to have done it before, but at least get the individuals trained up to know why they're doing what they're doing.
Matt,
and then I think
sorry, I was just going to bring Matt back in because I know he's got quite a lot of experience around the equipment area there as well. Can you talk a little bit to that, please?
Yeah, and I'd say, sort of reiterating what Sunil's saying, is one of the biggest risks I find when developing business case and moving them forward in an organisation is the equipment. And it's normally about the technical concerns about the equipment which is being specified. Typically with renewable and energy efficiency stuff, we're trying to promote something which is a little bit novel and different to the conventional, and concerns from the mechanical and technical teams within an organisation can typically be a real blocker unless you get them on side with the solution. I found that's the best way to do that is work really closely with your technical team, discussing why we're proposing it, but also trying to get them to work with a M&E consultant to come up with a design and rationale to give them the confidence that what we're specifying is going to work and provide the same level of service that we're getting with a conventional heating system, for example. So a typical concern we've had is with air source heat pumps and whether that's going to provide the same level of heating in a space, typically, and especially during the colder periods. So if you can get your technical team on board, get them to a report from from an M&E consultant who've got a good reputation with that team, then that's a great way of getting over that barrier and building a strong foundation for a business case which can be accepted higher up. So I think that's one of, for me, that probably the biggest risk factor I've found for a lot of projects I've worked with over the years.
Thank you, Matt. I am afraid that we're going to have to leave it here because I'm extremely mindful of the time. I would really like to thank you, Sunil and Matt, for joining us today. And one thing that I would like to remind our audience of is that you can always follow up with questions after the session as well. This session is recorded and a recording will be available for anyone who wants to listen again, or you can share it out. Thank you as well to our webinar support team who keep on delivering the magic behind the scenes. The guidance can be found through the QR code that was made available at the very beginning of this deck, and it will become available again after the session because we will be sharing the slides. If you found today's session useful, please, we also have a little poll so that we and our partners can get in touch with you after this session. So I'll give you a little bit of time to fill that out. I can only say that we are very excited about our next planned webinar on sustainability. We will be celebrating the publication of our Sustainability Survey 2024 report on the 4th of December. It will be launched the week beforehand, so people will have time to have a short perusal through the extensive report before you join us. But that leaves me to thank you and hopefully see you at the next session. Thank you.
Bye.